Does it surprise you to hear that according to lots of research and polling, self-identified Christians do not live significantly differently than people who claim no faith at all? Self-identified Christians do not live significantly differently than people who claim no faith at all, according to various polls, research done on this. So, just as likely to be in denial about addictive behavior, just as likely to lie, cheat, steal, just as likely to harbor hatred toward a neighbor, to engage in behavior that is homophobic, misogynistic, racist. Just as likely. And maybe when you hear that, or maybe you've read it before, the question emerges, well then why be Christian? What difference does it make? Who would want to be in on that? I think a lot of people have asked that question, and they've answered it in the ways that people have left or stayed away from churches in droves. Now, I suggest that it is not so much the way of Jesus that has failed us, but rather the ways that people who identify as Christian do or do not practice the faith or walk the walk. To paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, it is not so much the way of Jesus that has been tried and found wanting as it has been left untried. It's not so much the way of Jesus that has been tried and found wanting as it has been left untried. Now, what's at work is not a new thing, because I believe there are people who identify as Christian who certainly their decisions or being part of faith communities, there's sincerity in it, just like the first disciples of Jesus. These people, they have decided to follow Jesus. They are seeking first the reign of God, and they mean it. They've given up a lot to be on this path with him. But we also see again and again that even though they want to be part of God's transforming them, transforming the world, it's easy for them to fall back into old ways of thinking and doing and behaving. There is accessible to them the old life always, even as they're wanting to live into a new life and participate in the healing and formation of a new kind of world together. So the story today just offers one little slice of this, but we've got examples of this in abundance in the Gospels. So in the story today, you remember last week, Jesus was making it pretty clear how he was seeing the religious temple system. Not a fan. So now he's sitting with his disciples across from the temple, and it's believed that this second temple was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. I mean, it's an impressive building, especially for people from Galilee, right? They're from the hinterlands, and they've come to the big city, and here's the giant temple. And they're expressing the sense of awe, how they're impressed with it. And then Jesus, as you heard, he says, yeah, I'll tell you, the whole thing's coming down. It's all going to crumble. Whoa, killjoy. But why is he saying that? What's the point? He's reminding his disciples because it's easy for them to be enamored with or attached to this thing. Grand and glorious thing, but still a thing. And it's easy to center life and to focus on the thing. It's like what the psalmist was talking about in the passage you heard earlier. Those who put their trust in, it says gods, you could think what's finite. Those who put their trust in those things multiply their sorrows. There's this ancient understanding predating Jesus that people often, we might say, we hitch our wagon to what is fragile and finite and failing. Therefore, attached to or centered in what is fragile and finite and failing, well, in that kind of place, we live pretty small. We often live with a sense of scarcity, anxiety, fear, and it creates trouble for us, and then usually trouble in the systems we create out of the place of living small, in the finite, fragile, failing. And it's easy to do, and it's something that's in front of any of us who say we want to be part of this Jesus movement. Because I imagine there's folks here who at some point in your life, in the ways that, and some of you it might have been an immersion baptism, some of you might have been a confirmation class or first catechism, but there's all these different ways that people say, I have decided to follow Jesus. Some of you probably even sang the song. If you know it, sing it with me just for a minute. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. Except there's a whole bunch of turning back, right? I mean, that's part. There is the turning back. So in all sincerity, maybe even you woke up this morning like, I want to be part of changing the world. I want to be part of what God can do. I want to be part of something more just and beautiful and gracious. And then there's bills to pay, and emails to answer, and work to do, and the things that we're supposed to achieve, or I'm supposed to have this much money so I can buy that new thing. I mean, right? There's always things. I need to focus on getting that person elected, or I need to cheer on this particular team. And those things aren't bad in and of themselves, but often, even if we're not conscious of it, our lives end up centered, focused just in those things, which are all finite, fragile, and ultimately failing. So it's easy to get caught up just in those things. Now, I recognize even though we've had lockdown, and I don't know some people as well as I might have 2 years into a church as a senior minister, but I've talked to enough of you, you're bright. And we have a lot of intelligent, competent, gifted people. And so I do believe that in this community, we recognize, when we are people who say, I want to be part of what can transform the world, I want to be part of whatever God is doing, people mean it, and we understand it. So then why do we get, though, easily, any of us, pulled back into patterns of scarcity or fear or living small? Well, this is that part where, you've got that pastor who is a biology major, and I really dig learning science things still. And so, for example, there's lots of studies on this. I'm citing in particular one that was done by MIT, and I'll put in the tidings a link to the article if for those of you who want to dig in more. I've already got thumbs up. All right, thank you. Cite your sources, Michael. No, I know you didn't mean it that way. So this MIT article, the premise was, why is it so hard to break a bad habit? That's what they're looking at. And we might frame it positively, why is it hard to live into a good habit? And some of you already know this, but there is this research that indicates that whatever we've been doing, however we've been thinking, the patterns that we're living, they form neural pathways in the brain. And the more that we do them, you might think of it this way, the stronger that neural pathway is. The path gets carved out to kind of make it a metaphor. It doesn't actually look like this in your brain, but think of a rutted path. You keep walking it again and again. Oracle Road before they repaved it, right? The ruts, because they traveled over and over and over again. And so we have those well-traveled paths in our brain neurologically, and then you say, hey, I want to do it differently. I want to live into something different. I have decided to follow Jesus, to exercise more, to quit smoking. But we have these things. I've decided I want to do this. And so the decision to do it, that's a good start. But the neural pathways of the old pattern, they're all still right there, just as deep as they were before. And so just the decision is not enough, just neurologically, for us to really live into it. We'll keep falling back into what we've always known. So the research indicates that the only hope of living into whatever the new path is to keep at it, to keep living it, to have a discipline of I'm going to keep practicing it and practicing it and practicing it. By the way, the old pathway is always there. But in this practice, we carve a new pathway that at least we start to have a choice. We learn how to run on that neural pathway, so to speak. And so Jesus, his first followers are called disciples, which comes from the word discipline. Because there's this idea that they weren't just, I believe certain things or I hold to ideals. They practiced following in this path of Jesus. And they kept at it. And that's what Jesus is talking about in the passage, the language that we had, stay with it, stay with it, stay with it. They got to keep on keeping on, keep practicing it. He says you won't be sorry, you'll be saved. I need to do a little sidebar about saved. Keep in mind, I know we've talked about this before, but Jesus is not in a fire and brimstone church addressing people who've grown up in a fire and brimstone church. So when he says saved, his audience does not think, oh, good, I don't have to burn in a hot, hot hell for the rest of eternity. They've never heard of that. So just keep it right. That's not how they're hearing these words. So when Jesus says saved to this community of first century Jewish people, they're going to think about their faith tradition, and in Hebrew, the word saved. And what that word saved means is it has a sense of liberate. It has a sense of to make deeper and wider. It has a sense of expanding the boundaries. The opposite of living constricted and small and tight. So the way they'd hear saving is there's this life, say, apart from God, fearful, scarcity, restricted, small, and tight. He says, stay with it. You start to live large in the sense of you keep practicing, putting yourself in the presence and energy of the infinite divine. Well, then that starts to be alive in you. And then you have more capacities to live in that expansiveness, to live in what Jesus calls abundant life, the fullness of life, that comes alive in us. So stay with it, he's saying. Keep at it. You get saved from living small, narrow, fearful, rigid. Any of you know people living narrow, small, rigid? It's not really great, is it? I mean, sometimes we've done it. And so Jesus is saying, you can follow in a path that breaks you free of that, and then you live in this expansiveness, gracious, just, generous, blessing others. So that's good. But he's also in the story, and there is, as Grace put it nicely, starkness. But he's also recognizing if we start to live into this, we're traveling that new path, that way, that's expansive, it's going to change how we're acting, change how we're talking, change how we're in relationships, and that even if it's good, and he's promising that it is, it's still a change, and change scares people. Yes? So, I mean, I've used this line, I love it. A person in one church I serve, she says, I love change. So some of you are thinking, I love change. And then she was honest, she said, when I'm in charge of it. So the change that's happening in us, right? Just kind of bubbling up in us. And then people see it, and there can be resistance. There's fear. You're talking differently. You're living differently. Just go back to the small way. I knew that. So in all kinds of ways, people can resist and push back against. So the stark language is really describing that experience. Because Jesus is not a bait-and-switch rabbi. He wants people to understand what they're getting into. And so when it happens, they'll understand and be conscious of what's going on. And so back to that MIT study, what they discover is when we're under great stress or duress, like we're trying to live differently and there's pushback or squishing back on us, we're likely to revert to the old rutted paths. And that's why Jesus then at that moment says, stay with it, stay with it. So in the way that Jesus is talking about, we might think of it as there's the daily staying with it. A friend of mine calls it being prayed up. There's the daily staying with it, engaging in all the practices that connect you with God and the truth of who you are. Whatever that is, do it. Stick with it. He's not giving when you feel like it, when you're not busy with other things, because he's saying that then you're just going to keep running on the old paths. The only way to really live into this transformative life is to stay with it. And then when the hard things show up, we'll still have that temptation to go back to the old paths. That's just what happens. It's how we're wired. But now he's teaching them, as you feel that pressure or that tendency, you can get back on the path. You can keep on keeping on. Stay with it to the end. You won't be sorry, he says. You'll be saved. You'll live in that expansiveness, and you bring that expansiveness into the world. In a study group I was with, there was a woman who was sharing some of a pretty recent experience. She told us how she worked in a firm and that her immediate supervisor would often let fly racist comments. And she said they weren't racist on the level of, using the words that people aren't supposed to say, the name-calling words. It was more that subtle racism, what gets called today microaggressions. We didn't have that language back when this was happening, but that's what she was talking about. And she said that as that would happen every single time, she said, I feel this tightness in my chest and kind of clenching, and I'd be nervous. She said, but I wouldn't say anything because this is my supervisor. But I'd look around in the office. We have people of color. working with us? How are they feeling? What are they doing with this? She said, so for a number of years, I just felt really uncomfortable and guilty. She said, and why she was telling it in this group, she said, but actually being part of this group has helped me read these stories differently and to practice my faith differently. And before, I just kind of tried to numb my discomfort. Then I started to say, oh, how about I pray this? So I started to pray, saying, okay, God, what am I supposed to do with my racist supervisor? And she said, and as you all know, and we did, I also have a spiritual director. I was talking with her about this. And what started to emerge, even though it scared me, was you need to say something. So then part of my prayer became, God, help me have the courage to speak when I need to speak. She told us then there was this day where she didn't have to wait too long, where he said one of the things he says. She said, I also had a clarity that I was to speak truth in love. That my job was not to take him down or make him feel terrible. That what I'm yearning for is something better for him and better for our work environment. And that out of that place, that's what I was feeling God was calling me to speak from that place. So she said, I knew all that. Then he said the words, and I thought, nope. But she said, but I'd been kind of in my mind practicing praying it, and then I remembered, okay, pray right now. She said, I took this deep breath in. I said, okay, God, help me. And then I spoke my best understanding, the truth of what I was hearing and how it was hurtful. She said, my heart was racing. I was terrified. But at the same time, she said, it was like something was swelling up in me big. A courage? I don't know. She said, but I felt set free. If you really want to know how it all turns out, you can talk to me after. Because the point is she did it. She'd practiced and she could speak what was true and embody the grace and love and the abundance even in the face of what was hard. And that's what we're called to as well. We already know, everyone knows, I know well the old neural pathways, right? Stay busy, stay numb, stay focused, stay just whatever in the midst of all the chaos and challenges. We already know how to do that. So the harder one is to keep practicing this way where we place ourselves as best we know how in the presence of the infinite, in the presence of divine love, mercy, and justice, in hearing better stories, in listening in the silences, in connecting and talking about what matters with other people, to embody what is good and just, healing and hopeful. And a lot of times there's not a community service award when you do. Sometimes people are upset with you or challenge you, or even hate. And then we might want to go back to the old path. All right, I just need a drink to take the edge off. But what we need is the other spirit, the spirit who enlivens, that we can embody, that we can expand and live large, generous, gracious, just, creative, and good. And when we do that, it's good news for us, good news for the world. Jesus shows us the way. Stay with it. Amen.